Hi guys, welcome to History 1112. This is lecture number 1. As with all my lectures, please make sure and pay very close attention to the lecture terms as they come up. You can expect to see these on the exams. So this class begins around the year 1500 CE or AD, and this is a very dynamic time in world history. You've got a lot of movement among especially European powers overseas. They begin exploring the world around them, and a lot of this has to do with their desire to acquire spices from the Far East. Many of these spices that Europeans use to preserve their food cannot grow in the colder climate of Northern Europe. So instead, they need to find ways to get to places like modern-day India and China, where many of these spices that are used both for medicinal purposes as well as for cooking and preserving food, they need to have access to these areas of Southeast Asia. So when historians refer to several major motivating factors leading Europeans to take to the open oceans during the 16th and 17th centuries, we start with the idea of gold as part of a bigger trio known as gold, God, and glory. All right, so gold, the lure for profit. The spice trade was an incredibly lucrative business. So you need to understand that the word gold does not refer to the yellow metal initially. Okay, to begin with, adventurers like Christopher Columbus were looking for a faster way to get to China and India so that they could discover trade routes and then sit on top of them and extract money from the spice trade in these regions. It's only later on, once Europeans figure out that there's a couple of large continents that they didn't know were there, think North America and South America, it's only after they stumble across this new world, as they call it, that they then begin to think, okay, well, the spice trade is all well and good, but perhaps here we can plunder for actual gold or silver, pearls, any number of items that they could sell very readily back home in Europe. And then, as part of the sort of God part of the equation, historians kind of categorize this motivation as one in which it was the religion of many Europeans that began to really motivate them to reach out across the world. Think about it as a missionary impulse, however you want to call it, but the idea of spreading, in particular, Christianity to different parts of the world. And then, once you get to the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation, which we'll talk about in lecture number 2, then it becomes a competition about which flavor of Christianity do you want to spread. If you are a Catholic country, like Spain or Italy, one that kind of resists the Protestant Reformation, then you want to spread Catholicism, that variety of Christianity, overseas to get more adherents. If you are a largely Protestant country, like the Netherlands, then you want to spread Protestant Christianity abroad. So this is a key factor in leading these people to seek out other areas of the world, not just to make money, but also to spread their religious faith. And then finally, you have the glory part of the equation. The personal part of this is you're going to go on an adventure that very few people would have ever experienced for themselves. You are going to return back home from traveling thousands of miles to a foreign land, come back home hopefully having made some money in the process, retire as a rich, well-respected member of your community, and you'll regale everyone with stories of how you fought off 10 native peoples without a gun, just hand-to-hand combat, even though that may not have actually happened. But people will look up to you, right? So personal glory is part of this. And then in a bigger sense, national glory. The nation that has underwrote your voyage, right? Be it Spain or Britain or whatever country it was, that country too achieves national glory, kind of international fame. Look what we did. We planted a flag thousands of miles away from our home country, and we've claimed this territory. So all these things these countries believe reflect very positively back on them. Now, what also enabled some of these earliest voyages was access to capital, money, Okay, it cost a lot of money to raise a fleet of ships, to hire sailors, to outfit them with what they need, and to get this venture underway. Most of these early explorers were not wealthy men. Christopher Columbus ends up in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, the co-rulers of the country of Spain, and they like his plan, and they agree to front him, the capital. In other words, to finance this trip with the hope that they're investing in something that would pay off, that he would find a quicker route to India, and that they could then sit on these very lucrative trade routes to the Far East. For other investors, you'll see the phrase that I have here at the bottom of the slide, joint stock companies. In addition to monarchs like Ferdinand and Isabella, joint stock companies were private companies in which private investors, would jointly finance a trip. So these become kind of an early model for corporations. Private investors kick in some money on the front end, and then they hope to get paid back according to the percentage that they have provided at the beginning. So Ed contributes 10%, Bob over here contributes another 20%, and pooling those resources together, they finance this trip, and then they hope that they will then get a portion of the proceeds back. Or, like I said, early forms of corporations. Another thing that enables some of these voyages during the 16th and 17th century were advances in technology. So magnetic compasses learned from the Chinese. Astrolabes helped ocean-going vessels navigate the seas, chart their positions. When it comes to shipbuilding technology, you have a number of new advances by this period. Stern-post rudders, for instance, lateen sails to help better capture variable winds. All of these things make the trip a little less deadly and give these guys a little bit better way to track where they are as opposed to previous generations of sailors. The Portuguese really begin this process of overseas exploration. They are looking for a faster way to get to the Far East. With the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottoman Empire is now their rival. The Ottoman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean is preventing many European countries from using this as sort of a back door to get to India. So Portuguese explorers begin sailing southward. They begin exploring the Canary Islands, the Cape Verde Islands, the Madeira Islands, taking possession of these lands, and then also slowly mapping the contours of this large landmass that we refer to, of course, as the African continent today. Vasco da Gama, of course, being the explorer who first discovered an ocean route from his home country of Portugal to India, a 6-month-long journey underwritten by the Portuguese leader, Prince Henry the Navigator. Christopher Columbus, of course, I've already mentioned him several times. If you've taken a U.S. history class, your instructor should have talked about him. His voyages, 4 total voyages in which he, to the day he died, was convinced that he had actually found a part of India. He, of course, landed instead in the Caribbean islands, right? And his voyages on behalf of the country of Spain will ultimately lead successive Spanish explorers to come to the so-called New World here in the Western Hemisphere and take control of vast possessions of land, and also begin immediately enslaving the native peoples there. Even more ominously, we'll see what becomes known as the Columbian Exchange, whereby Europeans, for the first time coming from the old world of Europe, traveling to the Americas, will initiate an exchange of diseases, things like animals, livestock animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, an exchange of grains. New crops will be introduced that were first grown in Europe, now introduced for the first time in the Americas. And all these things will amount to a massive exchange of biological organisms, plants, animals, and most depressingly, diseases, okay, because the Columbian Exchange, Europeans are coming over. They have exposure, their immune systems have exposure to diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and what have you. So while they might sicken of these diseases, they didn't die of them because their immune systems have become accustomed to these diseases. They come to the Americas, though, and the native peoples here have not had any exposure to these diseases. Their immune systems are just going to be ravaged. You're going to see a mass die-off of Native Americans within the first 100 years of Columbus's first voyage. That's why this is referred to as the Columbian Exchange. And by mass die-off, I'm referring to 90 to 95% of Native peoples will die of European diseases introduced through this connection between the continents for the first time. Okay, when we talk about some of the first sustained contact between the Spanish and residents of what we think of as Central America today, those native residents being the Aztecs living in the Aztec Empire, Hernan Cortez is the man that really begins to initiate sustained contact and conquest of the Aztec peoples. So he lands in 1519 and begins, working out alliances with other tribal peoples to overthrow the Aztec Empire. He and his successors, of course, greatly aided by the diseases that they introduce to the Aztecs, and before long, their numbers have just been decimated due to warfare and disease. In order to encourage more Spanish settlement into the Americas, once they've come over and laid claim to these territories, the Spanish government will introduce over time the Comiendo System. And this is a system that accomplishes several important things from the standpoint of the Spanish government. What it entails is basically a system where land is granted to former members of the Spanish military. Thank you for your service to the Spanish Army. We've given you X amount of acres. You just have to get to the New World and take advantage of it. Think about it as a retirement benefit. All right, and also what is granted is the labor of the natives on that land. Now, nobody bothered to ask the native peoples if this system was okay. They would have said no, but that question was never even posed. But essentially, you were getting land, and you were also getting the labor of the native peoples on that land. And again, sort of a retirement system for a pension system for members of the Spanish military, and a way for Spain to get more warm bodies in some of these sparsely settled regions of the New World. Very importantly, though, this last point on the slide, the Comiendo System was a way in which the Spanish could spread Christianity in the New World. Because part of this system also was to introduce the religion of Catholicism to the native peoples. The person who took control of the encomendero, he was also responsible not just for feeding and housing the native peoples, whose land he took advantage of, and labor he took advantage of, but he was also expected to teach them about Christianity. So the Comiendo System is one of the chief ways early on in which the Spanish government is spreading Christianity. That's, remember, the God part of the equation: gold, God, and glory. Okay, there are a number of wide-ranging effects of European exploration in the Americas. Probably first and foremost, you're going to see a tremendous amount of economic and social inequality. These societies that the Spanish, and then later on the Dutch and the French and the Portuguese, the English set up, are societies in which they are in control of the native population. And so in many cases, you're going to see the exploitation of native peoples, their enslavement, their exploitation in a number of different ways, and them not being given any sort of political or economic power in these societies. And in Spanish holdings in particular, we'll return back to this point when we talk about Latin American history moving forward. This inequality is really pronounced. It's even drawn along racial lines explicitly. We'll talk more about that as we move forward. Another effect is tremendous wealth for these colonial powers. They are extracting, especially Spain during the 16th century, is extracting enormous amounts of gold and silver and turning some of these countries into a very wealthy country. New labor systems, I've already mentioned the enslavement of native peoples. That system begins to break down, though, as natives are dying in large numbers of diseases as a result of the Columbian Exchange. So what will happen is that African slaves will now be brought to the New World to perform the heavy labor, agricultural labor, working in mines, you name it. So as a direct result of the collapse of Native American civilizations due to disease, we're going to see African slavery being introduced to the New World. An arms race. Many of these colonial powers want to defend their colonies from rivals. They're going to start sinking a lot of their profits into ships, guns, these sorts of things. And then finally, mercantilism. A system whereby the home country basically controls all trade into and out of their colonial holdings. They reap the benefit, not the colonists, of this particular system.